Good morning. My name is Victoria, and I'm a partner here at Mercy View. Today, I'll be reading from 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 27 through 36. These verses can be found on page 130 in the blue Bibles under the chairs. If you don't have a Bible, please feel free to take one of these. They are our gift to you. 1 Samuel chapter 2, starting in verse 27. And there came a man of God to Eli and said to him, Thus says the Lord, did I indeed reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt, subject to the house of Pharaoh? Did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod before me? I gave to the house of your father all my offerings by fire from the people of Israel. Why then do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings that I commanded for my dwelling, and honor your sons above me by fattening yourselves on the choicest parts of every offering of my people Israel? Therefore the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that your house and the house of your father should go in and out before me forever. But now the Lord declares, Far be it from me, for those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed. Behold, the days are coming when I will cut off your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house. Then in distress you will look with envious eye on all the prosperity that shall be bestowed on Israel, and there shall not be an old man in your house forever. The only one of you whom I shall not cut off from my altar shall be spared to weep his eyes out, to grieve his heart, and all the descendants of your house shall die by the sword of men. And this that shall come upon your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, shall be the sign to you. Both of them shall die on the same day. And I will raise up for myself a faithful priest, who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed forever. And everyone who is left in your house shall come to implore him for a piece of silver or a loaf of bread, and shall say, Please put me in one of the priest's places, that I may eat a morsel of bread. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good morning. Good to see you. Welcome to Mercy View. My name is Brad, one of the pastors here, and if you are visiting with us today, welcome. Pray you've been encouraged by your time with us so far. If I had a chance to meet you, would love to do so. When you think of a judge, you probably imagine someone behind a podium in a black robe, maybe a gavel in their hand, hearing testimony from witnesses, listening to attorneys, ultimately dispensing some form of judgment on a case. These judges listen to facts, they render a verdict. That's their job, right? That's probably what you think of when you think of a judge. I've told this story before, but many moons ago, I was the assistant to the Morgan County of Missouri prosecuting attorney. And it was quite an eye-opening experience. Thursdays in the court at Morgan County were the days that, well, it was called court day. It was where everybody came together. It's where things were heard. It was an attempt to dispense justice, and it was a very imperfect and eye-opening experience for me. I actually had a lot of respect for the judge. That was the main guy who did the work of trying to figure out what to do with these cases. And many times he tried to work with people to try to help them rehabilitate their lives. The stuff that got to court day were the more serious or the most serious cases. And it was quite, it was just very revealing to me and humbling to me. I mean, I saw the dark underbelly of our world in a lot of ways. When we see judgment in the Bible, we don't know what to make of it, though, many times. We actually can understand more of our system here in the States with justice, but like when we look in the Bible, particularly when we look in the Old Testament and we see God judging people, dispensing justice, especially in the Old Testament, it really, probably for many of us, confuses us. We don't know quite what to make of it. It seems that the God of the Old Testament is a God of revenge, right? Getting back at people. It seems that God maybe is a God of spite. Surely, we think, on this side of the cross of Jesus, God has put an end to that form of justice, and surely, like exclusively now, is a God of mercy and grace and love. And today's passage is a great example for us. Like, we have to kind of face up to and deal with the God of this story in order to make sense of the God of all the stories of the Bible. So how do we make sense of this? Because how you make sense of this matters. When you come across this kind of language in the Bible, you will be tempted to create in your mind a version of God that may be not the God of the Bible. In fact, we're going to be confronted with this just in the book of 1 Samuel in the weeks and months to come as we continue to work through this. Many people have rejected God because of their perspective about the God of the Old Testament when they think of stories like today. And that'll make more sense as we go forward here. I mean, I think you maybe caught some of it as Victoria read the scripture this morning. But if we can't make sense of what we read today in our passage, I don't think you can make sense of God. And if we can't make sense of God, what typically happens is we either reject Him, which a lot of people do because of stories like this in the Old Testament, or we don't receive Him as He truly is. So this matters greatly. We've got to do business with a passage like this morning because what we believe about God matters. So, we are in a series in the book of 1 Samuel called In Search of a King, and we're looking at this book because ultimately the climax of this book that we're going to see about halfway through is that the people of God ask God for a king. They are looking for someone to be their protector, someone to make sure that they stay safe, particularly from surrounding nations, and they're going to ask God to provide something for them that they actually already had in Him, in God. They actually, we're going to see in the very first part of this book, they've already had in the person of Samuel, but Samuel wasn't good enough. And so this whole book is a story about the way that the people of God look for people to make sense of their lives, to be king, to rule and to reign in their lives. And in the first part of this book, we're looking at really God's provision to them in the person of Samuel. At this point in our story, Samuel is still a young man. He's in the tabernacle. He is engaging in priestly duties, and he's serving alongside some really bad people. And today we're going to see how God responds to that. And we saw a little bit of that last week as we saw the way in which Eli's sons were behaving. But this week we're going to put the focus on the dad. This week we're going to look at Eli himself. And as we do that, I want to invite you really to see two things. First is this: the judgment of God is the righteous response to sin. The judgment of God is the righteous response to sin. But second, the mercy of God is the gracious rescue from sin. The mercy of God is the gracious rescue from sin. So let's kind of place ourselves in the story where we're at in this book. Again, we're early in the book of 1 Samuel, just in chapter 2. And but as we entered into this Old Testament historical narrative, we see the story of God's people is not good. The wick of the lampstand that would have been in the tabernacle, which represented the light of God, symbolized His life, was almost out. These were very dark times in Israel, and we saw vividly last week that Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were defaming the worship of God by taking advantage of the people of God in some reprehensible and heinous ways. It was a window in to the depth and depravity of this time. In particular, it was a window into the depth of depravity and corruption in the leadership of the temple. And in many ways, what's happening with the people of God, what's happening with the nation of God at this point is that the darkness was beginning to overcome that light. Their father, Eli, last week we saw this, rebukes his sons. They don't listen to that. And then we also said that we notice Eli, though, doesn't do anything further. He reprimands his sons, but he doesn't remove his sons from leadership, is really what should have happened. And what that means then is that Hophni and Phinehas stay in the ministry, essentially. They continue to, we can assume, to dishonor the Lord. Eli is reluctant to critique the very system which was sustaining him. And Eli's negligence in the context, or Eli's negligence is the context for today's passage. So, if you have your Bibles or electronic devices, keep them open to 1 Samuel, beginning there in verse 27. Let's just start there. It says that a man came to Eli. Now, that phrase, man of God there, that came to Eli, means that this was a prophet. Now, we don't know who this prophet was. There's no name that is given, but the title that the writer of 1 Samuel gives this prophet lets us in on something very important. Because he is called a man of God, we know that Eli would have recognized him as a prophet. But not only that, these messengers that came to people like this were supposed to recite their messages to people verbatim. So when we see the prophet begin with that phrase, thus says the Lord, and use the first person in the body of the message, it would have all but confirmed to Eli himself that God was speaking to him through this man of God. So this prophet, the man of God, comes to Eli, and he has 3 questions for Eli. These are rhetorical questions. These weren't questions that he necessarily was going to have Eli answer out loud. But here are the questions. Look first at verse 27. The first one is this: did I indeed reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt, subject to the house of Pharaoh? Then look at the next question, verse 28. Did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod before me? And then the third question, beginning there in the middle of verse 28. I gave to the house of your father all my offerings by fire from the people of Israel. Why then do you scorn my sacrifices and my offerings that I commanded for my dwelling, and honor your sons above me by fattening yourselves on the choicest parts of every offering of my people Israel? Now Eli would have not been able to avoid answering all 3 of these questions in the affirmative. The questions were meant to be asked in such a way that Eli would have, with integrity, had to answer these questions with the word yes 3 times. And what the point of these questions really are is a phrase that you've probably heard before, but it's this: with great privilege comes great responsibility. See, the prophet is putting the priesthood into its proper historical and theological perspective for Eli. Now, Eli would have known what the theological and historical perspective should have been about this. And actually, this is a gracious move on the part of God through this prophet, is to remind him, here is what this was all about, Eli, if you've forgotten. And Eli would have known very well that the Lord had shown himself to Moses and Aaron while all of Israel was in slavery in Egypt, right? But God went further in Aaron's case, choosing him and his descendants from all the families in Israel to serve as priests. And even more, God provided a generous living for his priests from the offerings of his people. In other words, great grace had come to Eli. But in these questions, the man of God, the prophet, is trying to say to Eli, Eli, you have squandered it. Now I want you to notice something there in the last part of verse 29. When the prophet asks why Eli scorned God's sacrifices and offerings, it seems that God is including Eli in that. Last week, I'm not so sure we would have grabbed that. I didn't mention it last week. Even in the rebuke that Eli gives to his sons, we may not have grabbed this. But in this rebuke, through the prophet to Eli, it seems to be now including Eli in this dishonoring. Let me show you what I mean. Notice that the writer says, yourselves, when talking about eating the meat or the fat, I should say, and growing fat on that. In other words, I think that the writer here is letting us in on the fact that Eli himself had likely sinned in this way as well. And actually, if you think back to last week, this makes his rebuke against his sons ring hollow. In fact, if you go back and look at the rebuke, you will see he doesn't rebuke his sons for this sin. He skipped over it. And so, I think, in part, we're supposed to see that this is likely, because of the word yourselves here, Eli is complicit in this sin as well. So this is even more serious than not simply appreciating the goodness of God to his family. Here we see Eli was scorning and mocking this goodness by participating in the mockery of it. Are you with me? So verse 30, here's God's response to the mockery of the priesthood. He says, I promised that your house and the house of your father should go in and out before me forever. But now, he declares, look there, judgment. Now, first you may notice that it looks like God might be going back on his word. But you need to know about something here. This is very important. The Lord always has a prerogative or the freedom to revoke his promise if there is a willful disregard of the terms of that promise. You're going to see that in the Old Testament often. A covenant is two-sided. It is not unconditional in this sense. And there was a breach of the covenant that Eli and his sons made. They have ignored, they have dismissed the promise that God had given them in a sustained and prolonged way. And the result is what we see here. God is going to annul his promise. And he's going to judge the household of Eli. Now, how is he going to do that? Look at the beginning of at the end of verse 30. First, God says through the prophet that Eli's house will be lightly esteemed. Now, this is it seems like a nice way to say it. What this means, well, actually, let's look at verse 31 as well. It says that he will cut off Eli's strength and the strength of his father's house. If you put those two ideas together, he is saying that God is going to remove the honor that had been given to him from them by, yes, terminating them. By shriveling up Eli's branch of the family line. Pastor Sean said it this really well this week. He said, the man of God without a name, right, the prophet, is coming to remove the name of God from Eli's lineage. Second, verse 32, God says that his dwelling at Shiloh would cease to be his dwelling. In fact, if you look at Psalm 78, it seems to reference what God is talking about here. Listen to this in Psalm 78. He forsook his dwelling at Shiloh, the tent where he dwelled among mankind, and delivered his power to captivity. In other words, those who serve in the tabernacle will be diminished as the rest of Israel grows strong. God's judgment continues. Look at verse 33. God says that one man in Eli's line will not die young. He's actually talking about Eli himself. God is going to keep Eli alive to see the results of his and his son's sins, and it will deeply grieve him. And then God says this at the end of verse 33, your house shall die by the sword of men. And continuing to verse 34, and this that shall come upon your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, shall be the sign to you both. Both of them shall die on the same day. Now, you may remember last week when Eli scolded his sons, he warned them that because of their sins, and who their sins were against, God and God alone, the prospect of someone interceding for them and declaring them not guilty was slim, if not impossible. And here we see that Eli was actually right in his intuition there. God is going to give Hophni and Phinehas over to their sin, and it would result in their death. Which means that they would be separated from the grace of God, the opportunity to receive the grace of God for an eternity. We're going to actually see that play out in the chapters to come. Now, we said earlier that one of the more challenging subjects to tackle in the Old Testament, in the Bible as a whole just as well, is this: the judgment of God. If you don't notice this yet, we just heard that God would effectively end the household of Eli, not just by letting them die of old age. In fact, he said the opposite for everybody but Eli. He said Eli's house and family would die by the sword of men. Now, if you've been around the stories of the Old Testament for a while, this may not be new information for you. But if you're newer to the faith, and let's just be honest, if you've been around the faith for a while, these kinds of passages may come as a shock to us, right? What the question that comes to us is God does this sort of thing, really? Now, to understand the judgment of God, we have to understand the justice of God. See, God does not merely possess justice. He is justice. He is just. And to understand his justice, we have to understand some other moral attributes that he has that are closely related to this. And one of them is his holiness. Holiness really is the standard of God's justice. And because God is holy in relation to the world, he must always act in holy justice against sin. God cannot, let me just say it again, he cannot overlook sin and still be God. So judgment, when it happens, when it is meted out by God, it is necessitated by something outside of God. It is necessitated by man's sin. It is necessitated by man's unceasing rebellion. It is not because in his nature he is somehow vindictive or looking to get back at people or, enact revenge of some kind. When God judges, he judges righteously. And when he judges, he remains true to himself, and thus his own perfect and moral demands remain intact. And that means that his judgment is never, let me repeat, never arbitrary. When God moves in judgment, he does so for clear, predictable reasons that are consistent with his character. So this brings me to the first thing that I want to invite you to see this morning, and it's this: the judgment of God is a righteous response to sin. And that word righteous is important. The judgment of God is the righteous response to sin. Now, I think if we were to be honest, what sits underneath our objections to, or maybe our questions or confusion about God's judgment here in 1 Samuel 2 is one of two things. First, it would be maybe this. We don't really believe that anyone's sin is really that bad and deserves that, right? Like, surely, Brad, you're telling me, like, there's surely worse things that God could judge. But two, because we don't believe anyone's sin maybe is that bad, we don't believe that it needs to be dealt with in this way. It doesn't need to be dealt with in a radical, thorough, far-reaching way. Or said it another way, when we minimize sin, we tend to minimize the way that we believe that sin should be dealt with. Like if someone broke into your house, tied you up, and took everything that you owned, what would you want in the courtroom for that person? I think if you're honest, you want justice. You wouldn't be happy to find out the judge gave the thief 3 days of community service. There's something inside of you that knows that is unjust. You want the sentence to fit the crime, so to speak. Friends, God operates in much the same way. He sees sin, and He insists that something be done to protect His namesake, to protect His glory. But there is another aspect of judgment that we need to chat about briefly, particularly as it relates to the story that we're looking at today. Remember the sin, or the sins. The sins were the men of God, leaders, priests, taking advantage of God's people and thus defaming the worship of God. Okay? This is serious business. In his landmark book, Knowing God, the great theologian author J.I. Packer said this: "To an age which has unashamedly sold itself to the gods of greed and pride, sex, and self-will, the church mumbles on about God's kindness, but virtually says nothing about His judgment." Here's what I think Packer is saying. He is saying that in the times that we live today, the fact that God judges sin at all is something that even Christians are becoming desensitized to. And it shows up in a couple of ways. First, I think externally, in the counterculture series that we just did, we looked at ways in which our culture is increasingly and openly disregarding things that God says is right and true and good. And Christians are increasingly affirming this sinful indifference. And if the church continues to move in that direction, Packer is saying we're really mumbling on about God's kindness at the exclusion of His judgment. And I think that means then that the health of the church and the witness of the church will be in the days to come found impotent. I think that's Packer's point. But second, Christians are becoming desensitized internally as well. In many ways, Christians themselves are disregarding the seriousness of God's law in their own lives. And this is having a collective effect on the church as a whole. Here's Packer again from Knowing God. Can we doubt that the present barrenness of the church's life, listen, is God's judgment on us for the way in which we have dishonored the Holy Spirit? Packer, I think, is saying this barrenness, which I take to mean the lack of fruitfulness in the church or maybe distinctiveness from the world, is in direct relationship to the ways that we have shamed and disgraced the Spirit. Our passage today reminds us that that kind of sin, unrepentant sin, will be judged by the righteous one, Without this in the mix, God dispensing righteous judgment, we will have what theologian Richard Niebuhr said once. We'll have a God without wrath, bringing men without sin into a kingdom without judgment through the work of a Christ without a cross. When God judges Eli in our passage, He's not just judging Eli. The word house is repeated often in our passage today for a reason. God is judging Eli's house. And here's what that means. It is there that Aaron's priestly house was established. The priesthood was not just an individual matter, it was a house matter. God created a house for Aaron and his descendants, and Eli is a part of this house. And because he has not tended to his house is crumbling. Now don't miss this. This is, I think, in part what the passage today is confronting us with. In what ways is our house crumbling? And I think in particular, in what ways are our families or our homes crumbling? Eli, as a father, rejected his responsibilities to discipline his children. And the house of God, the tabernacle, and the people of God were harmed. Eli was turning a blind eye to a very real and obvious sin in his house. And in turn, because of his and his son's responsibilities in the tabernacle, it was harming the house of God. It was harming the people of God. In other words, the way in which Eli was running his family affected the church. So, if it hasn't felt heavy already, let me speak to the husbands and fathers for a moment this morning. Men, in what ways are you doing the very same thing? Turning a blind eye to, and I'm talking about sin, very real and ongoing and obvious stuff, okay? Willful, ongoing disobedience. Or maybe it's in your life. Maybe it's in the life of your family. In order really to know how to answer that question, you have to be able to define what sin is. And if you honestly can look at your life and the life of your family, maybe none of what I'm getting ready to say has any relevance to you, and that's fine. You can say, Brad, that isn't, that didn't really have a whole lot of help for me there. That's fine, that's fine. But one of the ways to think through how to answer this question, and I've used this before, is to kind of think through the prism of the Ten Commandments. And we don't have time to go through all of these, but let's just do the first one. Really, everything flows from that first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. What would it look like in your family to break that commandment? Because to break that commandment is sin, okay? It would be putting anything above God in your family. So the question then is, am I doing that? In what way am I doing that? Can I answer that question? If I can, if there's something I'm putting before God in my family, you are breaking that commandment. And you need to repent of that. It could be your own family, like putting your own family in front of God. Friends, job, food, sports, social media, entertainment, attachment to material goods. Right? We're talking about idolatry, the love of money, maybe, covetousness. I mean, you are responsible to see that your house, your families, are pursuing the Lord in integrity and honor. And here's part of the message today from our passage. I just said this a while ago. There is, I believe, an inverse relationship between how fathers and husbands lead their homes and the health and direction of a local church, in much the same way we see in our story today. The way in which you lead your home will have a direct impact on how Mercy View as a whole will continue to be strong and healthy as a local church. In fact, I would go so far as to say that husbands and fathers, you are to be the priests of your homes. Don't mishear me. I'm not suggesting that husbands and fathers are to stand as a mediator between God and man. That is strictly the work of Jesus. I'm talking in the metaphorical sense. You are to be the priests of your home so that you can bring a well full of gospel goodness to this church as you come and commune together with God's people. In the same way that Eli should have led his home but didn't, husbands, fathers, aspiring husbands and fathers, you are called to be guides for your home, to God and for God. Now, today's passage is a heavy dose of the way that God responds to the dishonor of his name. He takes it seriously. He judges it according to his holiness and righteousness, right? And sometimes, as we see in our passage today, that judgment is severe. But after bringing this judgment to Eli, do not miss this. God says this in verse 35. Let me read that again. And I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed forever. Even in the midst of God rendering his justice, he brings hope. He promises another priest, a righteous leader who would lead God's people in righteousness to honor him and to make his namesake glorious. Now, we don't know who this priest will be. Some believed it would be Samuel. I don't think it's Samuel, because Samuel ultimately is going to be for the nation of Israel its prophet judge, not a priest. Many believe that this faithful priest is going to come a few generations down the road, and a man named Zadok. There's a name for you if you're looking for a baby name. Zadok, Z-A-D-O-K. And this was a descendant of Aaron who King David would make a priest in his time. But don't miss what's happening here. We are seeing the mercy of God amidst his judgment. In fact, we see this often in the Old Testament. In fact, you almost see it almost every time you see this. Not every time, but almost every time. Think of the story of Noah. An act of judgment on many was also an act of mercy for a few. Noah and his family. The flood was God's judgment on the world. That's a whole other story. But it was a means of saving Noah and his family. Here, God's judgment on Eli and his sons is a means of saving God's family through a more righteous priest. But God's making a much larger promise here. God's prophecy here is really about a fully faithful replacement for Eli and his sons. God is ultimately saying that faithful priest will be fulfilled in the person and the work of Jesus. See, Jesus, as the writer of Hebrews says, would be a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God. Perfectly merciful, perfectly faithful. Jesus would not come to serve himself like Eli and his sons did. He would come to serve. And he would be a high priest that, again, as the writer of Hebrews said, would be holy and innocent and undefiled. In other words, where Eli and his sons were guilty and corrupted, Jesus would be the true and better priest who would faithfully and faultlessly honor God in all ways. And here's why that promise was necessary and is necessary for you. God will not give his glory away. God will not share his glory with another. In our story, he will not share it with dishonorable, deceitful priests. And he will not share it with those who live in unrepentant sin. He will always call us, for his name's sake, to come clean about what's going on inside of us that dishonors him. And the thing that's going on in our story today, this is true of 1 Samuel as a whole, God always has a plan, right? To bring about hope and peace to his people. Nothing's going to get in the way of that. But the promise that the prophet brings to Eli, that Eli himself likely would not receive, is that apart from Christ, our future is one of judgment. We are as guilty as Eli. You may even look at them and go, man, they deserved it. They defamed God. But that's exactly what we deserve. But the promise that comes to us today in this is the rescue that you need, the rescue that you need from the judgment that is over you, the act of judgment that needs to fall on one so that you can receive mercy, is exactly what our high priest did for us. Jesus, on our behalf, received our judgment so that you could receive God's mercy. This is the second thing I want to invite you to see. The mercy of God is the gracious rescue from sin. You may be here this morning thinking, man, I've really messed up, Brad. This sermon really convicts me. I don't know what to do with the sin that I feel in my life as a husband, as a dad, as a mom, as a wife, as just a Christian. Friends, the good news of the gospel for you is this. You have a great high priest who has already interceded for you on your behalf. He's received your judgment. So like when you dishonor the Lord, you have a way back to God. It's through Jesus, your high priest, your mediator. This high priest says, come to me, all you who are tired, and I'll give you rest. But the good news of the gospel is this too. The great high priest, he not only gives you an example of what it means to be faithful, but he gives you the fuel to be faithful. Dads, husbands, you can grow as a dad and a husband. Praise the Lord. You can be faithful as a husband and a dad with the Lord's help and in his mercy. And so I want to encourage you to lean into that and then lead faithfully and mightily as you rest in God's mercy. But I want to end here. The truth of what we just talked about, the good news of the gospel, the dads and the husbands, is true for all of us. Don't miss this. Our passage today is to remind us all, yes, first, that God's judgment is real, but in verse 35, that God's mercy is more. God's promise of a righteous priest here is a promise of a true and better priest who would, for the joy set before him, submit himself to the place where God's mercy and judgment would meet in perfect symmetry. And so for you, if you've placed your faith and trust in him, instead of judgment, you get to receive mercy. And it's from this mercy that we all now can live out our calling. What is our calling? 1 Peter 2, I think, says it well. As you come to him, a living stone rejected by men in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as what? A spiritual house. Right? Eli had defamed his house. But as you lean into the mercy of God, God desires to build you up into a spiritual house. And then listen to this, to be a holy priesthood. Friends, we're not only called to be a part of the royal priesthood and the spiritual house. This verse says that God is building us into that. I love how the great pastor and preacher Charles Spurgeon said it. He said, the Spirit of God quarries out of the pit of nature the stones that are as yet dead, separating them from the mass to which they adhered. And he gives them life. And he fashions and squares and polishes them, and they, without sound of axe or hammer, are brought each one to its appointed place and built up into Christ Jesus. Friends, through the mercy of our great high priest, we are being given life and being fashioned into a royal priesthood, a spiritual house. Why? To do what Eli and his sons did not. To honor the Lord in every way, in every part of our lives, in our families, in this church, and in our world. Let's give ourselves to our great high priest to be built up in that way. Amen. Let's pray together.